Hello, my friends. Welcome to another night of Fireside Mysteries. I'm Edward, your host, also from Warm Pages. Before we begin, is there a place from your past, a town, a street, a little shop, that you still think about fondly? Share a memory with us in the comments. I treasure reading them. Chapter 1, A Quiet End, Quiet Relief. The village of Lochdubh lay cradled between the loch and the brooding hills like a sleeping cat, indifferent to the wider world and quietly pleased about it. On a Tuesday evening in late September, when the sky above the water had gone the colour of a bruised plum, and the first chill of autumn pressed itself against the windows of the Lochdubh Hotel, a man called Fergus Liddell did not come in for his supper. This, in itself, was not a matter of great alarm. Fergus Liddell was, as the regulars at the bar would agree in careful, measured tones, a man who kept his own hours. He ran an antiques shop on the far end of the main street, a cluttered and slightly malodorous establishment called Liddell's Fine Pieces, which contained very few pieces that were either fine or particularly antique. He dealt in dusty china dogs, Highland landscapes of uncertain provenance, and the odd Victorian writing desk that had been quietly liberated from the estates of families too distracted by inheritance disputes to notice its absence. What he also dealt in, though nobody said this aloud, was information. Not the loud, gossiping kind that Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, trafficked in across garden walls. Liddell's information was quieter, more carefully gathered, and infinitely more dangerous. He had a way of listening that most people in Lochdubh found unsettling, a stillness to him, a patience that belonged more properly to a heron waiting at the waterside than to a man drinking a dram at the hotel bar. His eyes, small and pale grey, moved across a room with the steady sweep of a lighthouse beam, missing nothing. He had lived in Lochdubh for 11 years, arriving from somewhere near Inverness that he never named precisely, and he had made himself comfortable there in the way of a stone settling into mud. Gradually, without drama, until one day you could not imagine the landscape without him. Nobody much liked Fergus Liddell, but nobody said so. On the evening in question, Archie McLean, who drove the post van and had taken to stopping at the hotel most Tuesdays for a pie and a pint, was the first to remark on the absence. He did so with the elaborate casualness of a man who had been noticing the absence for 20 minutes and had only just permitted himself to mention it. "Liddell not in tonight, then," he said, to nobody in particular. Nessie Curry, who occupied her customary stool at the near end of the bar with the proprietary air of a woman who had paid for it through decades of consistent custom, looked up from her lemonade and shrugged one shoulder. "Perhaps he's found something better to do with himself," she said. Her twin sister, Jessie, who was sitting directly beside her as she always was, echoed the remark in her peculiar fashion. Better to do, she murmured, as though testing the words for structural integrity. Mr. Johnston, the bank manager, did not look up from his newspaper at all. The barmaid, a capable young woman named Shona, who had survived 3 winters in Lochdubh with her good humour largely intact, said that she expected Mr. Liddell had simply decided to cook for himself for once, and would there be anyone wanting another round before the kitchen closed? There was not much else said about it that evening. The following morning, Hamish Macbeth was finishing his second cup of tea and explaining to his dog Lugs why it was not yet time for a walk. When the telephone rang, it was Shona from the hotel, her voice carrying the particular quality of someone trying to sound calm while their hands were shaking. She had gone past Liddell's cottage on her way to open up, she said, because she'd seen that his lights were still on from the night before. The door had been unlocked. She had looked in. Hamish arrived at the cottage in under 5 minutes, which was the advantage of Lochdubh being the size that it was. Lugs trotted beside him, ears moving independently of each other in the way that suggested he was gathering information on several frequencies simultaneously. The morning was grey and soft, the loch barely visible through a light mist, and the smell of wood smoke from neighbouring chimneys drifted pleasantly through the damp air. It was, in every external respect, a perfectly ordinary Highland morning. Fergus Liddell was dead in his sitting room. He was on the floor near the fireplace, one arm outstretched as though reaching for something he had not quite managed to grasp. A wooden chair lay toppled on its side nearby, and the air in the room carried the faint, sweet-sour smell of whisky, though the glass on the mantelpiece was empty. There were no signs of violence that Hamish could immediately identify. No broken furniture beyond the fallen chair, no blood, no evidence of a struggle. Liddell lay on his back with his eyes closed, his expression composed, and his good tweed jacket, which Hamish had always privately thought was too good for a man who sold dubious china dogs for a living, neatly buttoned. Hamish crouched down and looked at him for a long moment. Luggs sat beside him and regarded the body with solemn brown eyes. "Well," Hamish said quietly, though not to anyone in particular, "there it is." He called Dr. Brodie, who arrived within the half-hour in a state of mild irritation at having his breakfast interrupted, and then Hamish made the necessary calls to the police in Strathbane, a duty he performed with the conscientious efficiency of a man who knows the paperwork is inevitable. Detective Chief Inspector Blair would be along presently, he knew, and would make the entire proceeding considerably more unpleasant than it needed to be. While he waited, Hamish walked slowly through the cottage. It was a tidy enough place, neater than its owner had been. The kitchen showed signs of a recent meal, a plate rinsed in the sink, a pot on the stove with the remnants of soup dried along its sides. A half-empty bottle of Glenfiddich stood on the sitting-room sideboard, and beside it, an envelope addressed in a hand Hamish did not recognise. He noted it without touching it. Dr. Brodie's preliminary opinion, delivered while he straightened his back with a wince, was that Liddell had been dead since sometime the previous evening, and that there was nothing immediately obvious to suggest how. He had the look, Brodie said carefully, of a man whose heart had simply given up. But he added, in the tone of a man who has been a country doctor, long enough to know that things are rarely quite what they appear to be, that they would need the post-mortem to say anything more definite than that. It was mid-morning before Hamish was able to step outside again. A small group of villagers had gathered at a respectful distance along the road. Loch-Dubh operated on the long-established principle that curiosity and propriety could be maintained simultaneously, provided one kept to the far pavement and spoke in low voices. What struck Hamish, standing there in the thin autumn sunshine with his tall, rangy frame and his characteristic expression of mild, thoughtful attention, was not the grief on the faces of those gathered. It was the absence of it. There was concern, certainly. The proper social machinery of concern was very much in operation. But underneath it, visible only if one knew what to look for, was something else, entirely. There was relief, not the crude, unconcealed relief of people who had actively wished a man dead. It was quieter than that. The subtle exhalation of a community that has been holding its breath for some time and has at last, cautiously, let it go. Hamish had lived in Loch-Dubh long enough to read its silences as well as he could read its speech, and this particular silence had a quality he recognised. He had felt it himself, he admitted privately on the walk over. A loosening of something he had not quite known was tight. He did not much care for that feeling. It made him uneasy in a way that Liddell's death itself, taken in clinical isolation, did not. Morag Sinclair appeared at the edge of the small crowd sometime around 11. She ran a crafts shop 3 doors down from Liddell's antiques business, and she and Liddell had been on friendly terms in the way that neighbouring shopkeepers sometimes were, proximity generating a warmth that might not have existed otherwise. She was a compact, capable-looking woman in her mid-40s, with dark hair going grey at the temples and steady green eyes. Hamish had always found her pleasant company. She baked excellent shortbread, and had once, quietly and without fuss, talked a distressed tourist's dog down from a wall. She looked at him across the road with those steady eyes, and he saw something in her face that he would think about for a long time afterwards. It was not surprise. It was not even sorrow precisely, though sorrow was what she was performing and performing it competently. It was the composed expression of a woman who had been waiting for something, and was now, one way or another, done with waiting. Hamish looked back at her for a moment, and then he looked away. He would need to think about that. Luggs pressed against his leg and made a small sound, the one that was not quite a whine, not quite a sigh. Hamish reached down and scratched behind the great flapping ears. "Aye," he said softly, "I know." Chapter 2, A Lifestyle That Doesn't Add Up. Detective Chief Inspector Blair arrived from Strathbane at 12:30, which was later than Hamish had expected, and in a considerably worse temper than even that delay could fully account for. He climbed out of the police car with the laboured indignation of a man who has been denied a proper lunch, his broad red face wearing its customary expression of a man confronting a world that has arranged itself specifically to inconvenience him. "Macbeth," he said, by way of greeting. "Sir," said Hamish, by way of reply. Blair surveyed the cottage, the loch, the quiet street, and the general atmosphere of Loch-Dubh with the compressed displeasure of a man who had spent 20 years hoping that Highland villages would improve themselves and had received, in all that time, not the slightest encouragement. Detective Constables Anderson and McNab trailed behind him, Anderson looking as though he would rather be somewhere else, which was his customary expression, and McNab looking faintly hungry. "Natural causes," Blair announced before he had set foot inside the door. "Man his age, living alone, probably his heart. We'll wait on the post-mortem and that'll be that." Hamish said nothing. He had learned, across many years of professional acquaintance with Blair, that saying nothing was usually the most efficient strategy, in the same way that one did not argue with the weather. Blair went inside, spent 11 minutes in the cottage, emerged again, looking no more satisfied, told Anderson to take statements from the neighbours, and departed for Strathbane in time to salvage the afternoon. Hamish watched the car go with the expression of a man who has just been left in charge of something, which was, in effect, exactly what had happened. He went back inside. The post-mortem, when it arrived 2 days later, was not definitive. There were no obvious signs of poisoning and no evidence of physical assault. The pathologist, a careful and thorough woman named Dr. Isla Kerr, who had no patience whatsoever for sloppy conclusions, wrote that cardiac arrest could not be ruled out, but neither could it be confirmed as the sole cause, given certain anomalies in the tissue samples that she intended to investigate further. Blair read this, declared it typically unhelpful, and filed it in the category of things that would probably amount to nothing. Hamish read it 3 times. On the morning after Blair's departure, he had returned to the cottage under the broad authority of a rural constable, who was nobody above him paying very close attention, and he had gone through it properly. He did this with the methodical patience that had always been his greatest investigative asset, moving slowly from room to room, opening drawers with gloved hands and setting their contents out on the kitchen table where the light was better. It was the wardrobe that first gave him pause. Liddell had owned 4 suits, not the shiny-elbowed, slightly defeated suits of a man scraping along in a trade that barely covered his bills, but properly tailored ones, the kind that came from establishments in Inverness or possibly Edinburgh, dark wool with good stitching and the subtle confidence of clothes that had cost real money. There was a cashmere overcoat. There were shirts of a quality entirely inconsistent with the price of the china dogs on the shelves of Liddell's fine pieces. Hamish stood before the wardrobe for some time, hands in pockets, considering. He moved to the sideboard in the sitting room next, where the half-empty bottle of Glenfiddich had stood. He lifted the bottle and examined the label with the attentiveness of a man who knew his whiskies, which, being Hamish Macbeth of Lochdubh, he naturally did. It was a 21-year-old single malt, the sort that was bought as a gift for someone you very much wanted to impress, or as a private indulgence by someone who felt they had earned it. A bottle of this age cost considerably more than anything Fergus Liddell should have been drinking on a routine Tuesday evening in late September. The kitchen press yielded similar evidence. 2 bottles of wine from a reputable French vineyard, a tin of expensive biscuits, and a box of Belgian chocolates, the last of which had been opened and was 3/4 consumed. Hamish regarded the chocolates for a moment with the solemnity they deserved. He went through the desk in the small back room with particular care. Most of what he found was ordinary enough. Receipts for stock purchases, correspondence with a couple of antiques dealers in the south, an overdue electricity bill that suggested Liddell was not entirely indifferent to the appearance of modest means. But folded into the back of the bottom drawer, tucked beneath a copy of a 1987 Road Atlas of Scotland, was a bank statement. Hamish sat down in Liddell's desk chair and read it carefully. The most recent deposits did not correspond to anything that an antiques dealer of Liddell's apparent standing should have been receiving. Over the previous 8 months there had been 6 separate cash deposits, ranging from £300 to £800 each, arriving at irregular intervals. There was no note of their origin, as there would not be with cash, but their very irregularity was itself a kind of pattern, not the steady rhythm of a legitimate secondary income, but the lumpy, uneven flow of payments made reluctantly by people paying when pressed. Hamish set the statement down on the desk and looked out of the small window at the back garden, where the remains of what had once been a vegetable plot had long since surrendered to grass. A robin was conducting a thorough inspection of the overgrown bed with the busy focus of a professional assessor. He thought about Morag Sinclair. She had come to him the previous morning, not to the cottage, but to the police station, which was to say she had knocked on the door of the house that was also the police station, which was to say she had knocked on his door and accepted a cup of tea at his kitchen table. She had told him composedly that she and Fergus had been on friendly terms, that she would miss his company at the monthly village hall meetings, and that she hoped the whole business would be resolved quickly for everyone's sake. She had said all of this without once quite meeting his eyes, which was a thing Hamish noted without remarking upon. Her grief, such as it was, had been measured out in careful, appropriate portions. A slight tightening around the mouth when Liddell's name was spoken. A brief pause before she answered certain questions, as though checking her words for accuracy before releasing them. She was a woman in full command of herself, which was admirable under any circumstances, but was, in the context of an unexpected bereavement, just slightly too admirable. She had also, Hamish now recalled, glanced at the bank statement on the kitchen table. He had been looking through his notes when she arrived and had not thought to put it away, with an expression that had lasted no more than a second before her face returned to its settled composure. But a second was enough. He folded the bank statement carefully and placed it in his inside jacket pocket. On the way back to the station he stopped in at the post office, where Mrs. Mackenzie presided over the village's postal and informational requirements with equal authority. He asked in his most casual register whether she recalled Liddell having received any regular visitors in recent months. He framed the question as idle curiosity, which it was not. Mrs. Mackenzie required no such pretence. She was a small, brisk woman who regarded information as a public utility and saw no reason to be coy about it. He had a few, she said. Not friends, mind you. People don't visit Fergus Liddell for the pleasure of his company. She paused with the precision of a woman selecting the right tool for a job. Angus MacLean the fisherman came twice that I saw. Dr. Forbes came once in his car and sat outside for 20 minutes before you went in. And Callum Fraser, now that surprised me, Callum Fraser doesn't come into the village if he can help it. He was here in August, left looking like a man who'd paid for something he didn't want. She added after a beat, and Jessie Curry was in there one afternoon, which she'll not thank me for telling you. Hamish thanked her, bought a stamp he did not need, and walked back up the road with his hands deep in his coat pockets, and lugs at his heel, the pair of them moving through the thin autumn sunshine in a comfortable and practised silence. Something was taking shape in his mind, not yet fully formed, more like the outline of hills in early morning mist. He had a bank statement, a wardrobe full of clothes no antiques dealer could afford, a collection of visitors who had all left looking diminished in some way, and a village that had greeted the death of one of its members with the careful collective sigh of a community setting down a weight. He was beginning with a profound lack of enthusiasm to understand what kind of weight it had been. Chapter 3. The Ledger of Leverage. The notebook turned up on a Thursday. Hamish had been back to the cottage twice since his first proper search, each time with the growing conviction that he had not yet found the thing that mattered most. A man like Fergus Liddell, patient, methodical, and possessed of the hoarder's instinct for preservation, would not have trusted something as important as a record of his arrangements to memory alone. There would be a document of some kind. There had to be. The question was where a man with a talent for concealment would choose to conceal it. On the first return visit, Hamish had checked the obvious places: loose floorboards, the backs of drawers, behind the seldom moved furniture. On the second, he had gone through the bookshelves with the thoroughness of a man who understood that books themselves were rarely as interesting as what people hid inside them. He found 2 £50 notes folded into a copy of the Highway Code, and a faded photograph of a woman and a child whose identities he could not determine, but nothing more immediately useful. On the Thursday, it was Luggs who led him to it. This was not, strictly speaking, how Hamish reported the discovery in his notebook, where he wrote simply that a thorough search of the utility area had revealed a concealed document. But the truth was that Luggs had been nosing around the small lean-to at the back of the cottage with an insistence that went beyond normal canine curiosity. His broad head pressed repeatedly against the lower section of the wall beside the washing machine with the focused determination of a dog who has identified something worth identifying. Hamish moved the washing machine. Behind it, fixed to the wall with a strip of ordinary brown parcel tape and wrapped in a freezer bag against the damp, was a notebook of the small, hard-backed variety sold in every newsagent in Scotland. Its cover was dark green. Its pages were dense with handwriting so compressed and abbreviated that his first impression was of a foreign language, which was, he supposed, precisely the intention. He sat down at Liddell's kitchen table with the notebook, a mug of tea he had made himself without guilt or particular reflection, and the quiet attention of a man facing a puzzle he's professionally obliged to solve and personally to some degree reluctant to. The system, once he began to work at it, was not as impenetrable as it first appeared. Liddell had not been a cryptographer. He had been a careful man protecting himself against casual discovery, not against genuine investigation. The entries used initials rather than names, dates written in reverse order, and sums of money replaced by what appeared to be page numbers from some reference book, though Hamish quickly determined that the amounts were simply divided by 7, a sufficiently obscuring device for a village ledger. He worked through it over the following 2 evenings at his kitchen table, Lugs asleep at his feet, and the wood stove ticking quietly in the corner. He made a separate sheet of decoded entries, wrote the real dates, and adjusted figures beside each set of initials, and by the end of the second evening he had something that looked, with uncomfortable clarity, like a map of Loch Dubh's private grief. The entries stretched back 4 years. There were 9 sets of initials in all. The amounts varied considerably. Some entries showed small sporadic payments, others showed large sums paid with grim regularity. Each set of initials was accompanied by a phrase, always brief, always oblique, and always sufficiently suggestive that Hamish, who knew his village well, could feel the shape of the secret even where he could not yet name it precisely. He read through the phrases with his pencil moving slowly beneath each one. Some a mistake. That appeared beside initials he was fairly certain belonged to Angus MacLean, which was consistent with what Mrs. Mackenzie had told him about the fisherman's visits. The payments beside it were modest and intermittent, the sums of a man paying what he could manage rather than what he had been asked for. Fire Night and Child Witness appeared together beneath initials that took Hamish a moment longer to work out, but which he eventually attributed, with a cold settling in his chest, to Callum Fraser. These were the largest entries in the notebook. The most recent payment, made 6 weeks before Liddell's death, had been for what decoded to nearly £900. It was preceded by 3 others of similar size in the preceding year alone, which suggested either an escalation in Liddell's demands or a deterioration in whatever arrangement had previously kept things stable. Inheritance Truth sat beside a set of initials he could not immediately place, associated with payments that had begun recently and were still small. A man or woman in the early stage of being squeezed, perhaps not yet fully aware of how these arrangements tended to develop. Shipment Night was beside initials he thought, with some discomfort, might belong to a man he played drafts with on alternate Fridays. And then there were 2 entries he found particularly striking, not because of their size, but because of their proximity to each other in the notebook's chronology. Old Affair appeared with initials that matched Jessie Curry, who featured prominently in Mrs. Mackenzie's account. The payments were regular and had been running for 3 years, and beside another set of initials, ones that required no decoding at all, as they were among the very few full entries in the notebook, was the phrase, "Records changed," accompanied by a name, Forbes. Dr. Alistair Forbes, who had sat in his car outside Liddell's cottage for 20 minutes before going in. Hamish sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a while. Lugs opened one eye, assessed the situation, and closed it again. There was a particular quality to the silence of Loch Dubh at night, when the last lights along the waterfront had gone out, and the loch settled into its own dark reflection. It was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of a place containing everything it always had, simply without the noise. Hamish had lived inside it long enough that he rarely noticed it consciously. Tonight, with the decoded notebook on the table before him and the names of his neighbours arranged in a column beside their secrets, he noticed it. He thought about the kind of man who sits in a small shop handling other people's discarded objects, and who also, in the quiet intervals between customers, sits very still and listens to the life of a village flowing around him, who stores what he hears with a patience that is its own kind of intelligence, who one day begins to recognise that information, in the right hands and in the right circumstances, is worth considerably more than an old writing desk of uncertain provenance. He did not suppose Liddell had started out intending to become what he had become. These things rarely began with clear intent. More likely there had been a single occasion, a piece of knowledge acquired by accident and tentatively deployed, and then a discovery that it worked, that people would pay and go on paying and say nothing. And then the habit of it, which was harder to break than most habits, being as it was so profitably reinforced. The question that mattered now was not what Liddell had been. The question was which of these 9 frightened people had decided at some point in the week of the 23rd of September that they had had enough. Hamish folded his decoded sheet, slipped it into the notebook's cover, and put the notebook in the locked drawer of his desk where the station records were kept. He stood at the window for a moment looking out at the loch, which was showing the first faint lightening of an early dawn along its far edge. It was going to be a complicated autumn. He put the kettle on again. Chapter 4. The First Confession. Angus MacLean kept his boat at the far end of the harbour, past the point where the newer vessels were moored, in the slightly apologetic way of a man who has learned not to draw attention to himself. It was a modest fishing boat, well maintained in the practical sense. The engine was reliable, the hull was sound, but not beautiful, not the kind of vessel a man took pride in from a distance. It was a working boat belonging to a working man, and it smelled of diesel and salt and the particular cold that comes off deep water even in summer. Hamish found him there on a Friday morning, scrubbing the deck with a long-handled brush and the air of a man performing a task that had the advantage of requiring most of his attention. Angus was somewhere in his mid-50s, built along the lines of a man who had spent 30 years pulling things out of the sea, broad through the shoulders, thick-handed, with a weathered face that had settled into an expression of permanent mild endurance. He was not a man who smiled easily, but when he did it transformed him briefly into someone considerably younger. He did not smile when he saw Hamish coming along the harbour wall. Hamish stepped down onto the boat with the easy confidence of a man who had done it many times, nodded a greeting, and crouched down to scratch behind the ears of Angus's elderly terrier, who was sleeping in a coil of rope with the total commitment of an animal that has correctly identified its priorities. This took a moment. Hamish believed in taking a moment. "Grand morning for it," he said. "Aye," said Angus, and went on scrubbing. Hamish stood up and looked out at the loch for a while. A heron was standing in the shallows near the far bank with its customary expression of austere disapproval. The water was very still. Somewhere behind them, up on the main street, a delivery lorry was making a noise that suggested it was attempting to reverse into a space several feet smaller than itself. "I found Liddell's notebook," Hamish said, conversationally, as though this were a natural continuation of the subject of morning weather. The scrubbing brush stopped. It did not stop dramatically. Angus was not a dramatic man, but it stopped completely, and the hand holding it went very still, and the quality of the silence that followed was the particular silence of a man recalibrating everything he had been telling himself for the past fortnight. Hamish waited. He was good at waiting. It was, in many respects, the skill that had served him best over the years, in preference to persistence, cleverness, or the aggressive interviewing techniques that Blair favoured, and that invariably produced either lies or solicitors, and occasionally both. Angus set the brush down on the deck. He straightened up slowly, the way a man straightens when his back has been at it since 5 in the morning, and he turned and looked at Hamish with the direct, assessing gaze of someone deciding at last how much truth the situation requires. "What does it say?" he asked. "It says summer mistake," Hamish said, "and a set of numbers that add up to rather more than a fisherman earning modest rates should have been paying out over the past 3 years. Angus was quiet for a long time. The elderly terrier shifted in its rope coil, twitched once, and went back to sleep. Out on the loch, the heron lifted off from the shallows with the slow, prehistoric dignity of a creature for whom urgency has never been relevant, and disappeared in the direction of the far shore. "It was 11 years ago," Angus said at last. He said it the way a man says something he has been carrying for so long that the words have worn smooth with the weight of being held. "The Moira Jean, that was the boat." He told it without embellishment, in the flat, factual manner of someone reporting something that happened to another person in another life, though his hands, clasped now on the rail, told a different story. The Moira Jean had been his previous boat, older than the current one and considerably more troublesome. The engine had been failing for 2 seasons. He had lacked the money to replace it, and had lacked, he said with a brief darkening of expression, the ability to admit this to anyone who mattered. He had sunk the boat deliberately, in a location where it could be attributed to the engine failure that everyone knew was coming anyway, and he had claimed on the insurance. It had not been a vast sum, enough to replace the boat and settle the debts that had been accumulating around him. He had told himself it was not so different from the outcome nature would have produced eventually, which was the sort of reasoning, Hamish reflected, that sounded much more persuasive at 3 in the morning than it did in the clear light of a Friday harbour. Liddell had been out that night, not on the water. He had been walking the coastal path, which he did sometimes in the evenings, a habit Angus had not known about and had cause to regret. He had not seen what happened, precisely, but he had seen enough, and he had filed it away with the patience of a man who understood that knowledge ripened best when left alone for a time. He had approached Angus 8 months later, when the insurance claim had long been settled, and Angus had perhaps begun to believe that the whole business was behind him. The first payment had been £300. The subsequent ones had been irregular. Liddell had not been systematic about Angus in the way he had apparently been about others, but they had continued, and each one had arrived with the quiet implication that they would go on, arriving indefinitely. "Did you think about stopping him?" Hamish asked, without particular emphasis. Angus looked at him steadily. "Every man thinks about it," he said. "That doesn't mean every man does it." Hamish nodded. He believed him. There was a quality to Angus MacLean's shame that had nothing performative about it. It sat on him like weather, like something external that had moved in and made itself permanent. A man wearing his guilt, this consistently did not have the hollow look of someone who has done the thing that would end it. "Did he ask you for more recently?" Hamish asked. "In the month before he died?" Angus shook his head. "Nothing since August. I thought—" He stopped. Started again. "I thought maybe he'd found someone more worth his while." That was consistent with the notebook's chronology, Hamish noted. The August payment had been followed by the new entries, the small recent ones, the ones that suggested Liddell had been expanding his interests elsewhere. Perhaps Angus had simply become, in Liddell's private accounting, a settled and reliable line rather than an area for development. Hamish straightened his cap, which had been moved by the harbour breeze to an angle that did not especially suit him, and he looked at Angus for a moment with the expression that those who knew him well would have recognised as the one that appeared when he had heard what he came to hear, and was in the process of deciding what to do with it. "I'll need you not to go anywhere for the time being," he said. "Where would I go?" said Angus, with a short, humourless sound that was not quite a laugh. Hamish stepped back up onto the harbour wall and paused. "The insurance," he said. "Was the amount significant?" Angus looked down at the deck. £4,200, he said. "I paid most of it back to Liddell across 3 years." Hamish said nothing to this. He walked back along the harbour wall with lugs beside him, and he did not look back because there was nothing further to see at the moment, only a man standing on a boat in the Friday morning sunshine with his hands on the rail and his eyes on the water, carrying the particular expression of someone who has just set down one kind of weight and picked up an entirely different one. He was fairly sure Angus had not killed Fergus Liddell. He was considerably less sure about the next name on his list. Chapter 5. Secrets Multiply. Jessie Curry occupied the right-hand half of a semi-detached cottage on the road that ran behind the hotel, a fact that had given rise to considerable philosophical speculation over the years regarding how two women of such apparently identical character could manage to live in separate dwellings. Her sister Nessie occupied the left-hand half. They shared a garden wall, a postbox, and a comprehensive knowledge of everyone else's business, which they deployed between them with the efficient coordination of a 2-person relay team. Hamish had always found them individually easier than together, which was not saying a great deal. He called on Jessie on a Saturday afternoon, choosing the hour deliberately, late enough that Nessie would be at the church hall for the flower arranging committee, early enough that Jessie would not yet have joined her. He brought no notebook and no particular air of official purpose. He brought instead a tin of shortbread that Mrs. MacDonald at the bakery had pressed upon him that morning, under the impression that he was not eating properly, which was not inaccurate. Jessie answered the door with an expression that moved through surprise, calculation, and a determined settling on cordiality in the space of about 2 seconds. She was a small, sharp-featured woman with white hair set in the rigidly permanent style of someone who has not deviated from it since 1987 and sees no reason to begin. She had sharp blue eyes that noticed everything, and a mouth that, in repose, suggested the habitual suppression of several opinions simultaneously. "Hamish," she said. "Come away in, then." Her sitting room was very tidy, the way rooms are tidy when they belong to people who find tidiness an expression of moral position, rather than mere preference. The ornaments were dusted, the cushions were squared, and there were flowers on the windowsill that Hamish recognised as having come from the same arrangement, currently being created at the church hall, which suggested Jessie had made her exit before it was finished. He set the shortbread on the table. Jessie made tea with the brisk efficiency of someone who has made it 10,000 times and has no patience with people who make a ceremony of it. She brought it through on a tray with the good cups, which told him she was treating this as a formal visit whether or not he was. They discussed Liddell's death for a few minutes in the careful, circumnavigating way of two people who are both aware that they are circumnavigating. Jessie expressed the appropriate sentiments. It was a shock, a terrible thing, a man in his prime or near enough, and Hamish listened and nodded and allowed the circumnavigation to run its natural course, because experience had taught him that people reached the point of their own accord if you gave them sufficient runway. Jessie reached it sooner than he had expected. She set her teacup down with a small definitive click and looked at him with the expression of a woman who has decided, after a fortnight of private deliberation, that pretending is more exhausting than confessing. "You found something in that cottage," she said. It was not quite a question. "I found a notebook," Hamish said, "with my initials in it. With a great many people's initials in it." This appeared to give her some small measure of comfort, which Hamish had intended. He watched her absorb it, the knowledge that she was not uniquely exposed, that the ledger contained a community rather than a single name, and he saw her shoulders drop very slightly from the position they had been holding for the past 14 days. She had been married, she began, keeping her eyes on the cup in front of her. Married for 9 years to a man called Robert Curry, who had been charming and handsome in the way of men who deploy charm and handsomeness as working tools, and who had, over the course of their marriage, transferred his attentions to a succession of other women with an ease and frequency that suggested considerable practice. Jessie had conducted a parallel arrangement of her own for the last 4 years of the marriage, not as revenge, she said firmly, though Hamish privately thought the distinction was perhaps academic, with a man from Brakey who was married and whose wife was alive and well and entirely unaware of it. Robert Curry had died of a heart attack in 1998, which had simplified matters considerably. The man from Brakey had moved away the following year. The affair had ended, the marriage had ended, and Jessie had settled back into the life of Lochdoub with the air of a woman returning from a foreign country and choosing not to discuss the particulars of her travels. Liddell had known the man from Brakey, it emerged. Not well, but sufficiently. A chance conversation some years ago, a careless remark, a name mentioned. Liddell had possessed, as Hamish was coming to appreciate with ever-increasing thoroughness, an almost geological memory for anything that might one day be useful. The first approach had come 3 years ago. The sum requested had been modest. Jessie had paid it in cash at the back door of Liddell's Fine Pieces, and she had gone on paying it, and she had told no one, including and especially Nessie, who would, in Jessie's words, have broadcast it from the top of Benstack given half a chance. When she finished, Hamish asked her whether Liddell had made contact in the weeks before his death. "He wrote me a note," she said. She got up and brought it from the bureau in the corner, the original, which she had kept, which told him something about Jessie Curry's fundamental nature. She handed it to him without visible reluctance. It was 2 sentences long, a statement of an increased sum and a date by which it was expected. The date was 3 days after Liddell's death. Hamish pocketed the note, drank the last of his excellent tea, and took his leave with the shortbread tin still on the table, which he thought she probably needed more than he did. He drove out to Dr. Forbes's surgery afterwards, arriving at the tail end of the afternoon appointment list. Alistair Forbes was a trim, careful man of 60, with the watchful manner of someone who has spent a career listening to what people are not quite saying. He had a reputation as a good doctor, conscientious, discreet, not given to the performative reassurances that patients often preferred, but medicine did not always support. He saw Hamish waiting in the near-empty reception, and came out to meet him rather than making him sit, which was either courtesy or the preference of a man who wished to control his own exits. They walked in the car park for the conversation, which Forbes suggested, and which Hamish accepted without comment. The air was cold now, properly autumnal, and the hills behind the village had gone rust and amber along their upper slopes. Forbes had, 11 years ago, altered a colleague's records. The colleague had made a serious error, a prescribing mistake that had caused a patient prolonged harm, though not death. The colleague had come to Forbes in desperation, and Forbes had agreed, in a moment of misplaced loyalty that he had not stopped regretting since, to amend the documentation in a way that reduced the apparent severity of the oversight. The colleague had since retired and moved south. Forbes remained, carrying his share of it. Liddell had obtained the information through a source Forbes could not determine, even now. A former receptionist was his best guess, but he had never confirmed it, and the not knowing had been its own particular torment. The payments had been regular, professional in their way. Liddell had not been greedy with Forbes, as though recognizing that a doctor, more than most, had alternative means of making problems disappear. "Did that thought occur to you?" Hamish asked straightforwardly. Forbes looked at him for a long moment. "It occurred to me," he said. "Most thoughts occur to a person at one point or another. The question is what you do with them." Hamish accepted this, noting it. On the drive back to the station, with lugs sprawled across the passenger seat, and the last light fading behind the western hills, he found himself thinking that Fergus Liddell had constructed, across 11 years in Lochdu, a remarkably comprehensive architecture of human misery, and that he had done it with no tools more sophisticated than patience, memory, and a thorough understanding of how much people would endure rather than be known. The tragedy of it, if tragedy was the right word, was that he had apparently been very good at it indeed. Chapter 6. Too Many Motives. There was a large sheet of paper pinned to the wall above Hamish's desk by the end of that second week, which was not strictly regulation, and which he took down whenever he had reason to expect Blair, which was not often, but was often enough to make the taking down a habit. On it he had written 9 sets of initials arranged in a loose column, with decoded figures, dates, and phrases beside each. He had added notes in his small, cramped handwriting, the kind that had once prompted his primary school teacher to describe it as resembling barbed wire in a high wind, and connected certain entries with lines and queries that would have meant nothing to anyone else, and meant, at this stage, only slightly more to him. He stood before it on a Monday morning with his second cup of tea and his most productive expression, which was the one that looked, to the uninformed observer, most like he was thinking about something else entirely. The sheet told him several things with reasonable clarity. It told him that Fergus Liddell had been systematic about some of his victims and opportunistic about others. The larger, more regular payments came from Callum Fraser and, to a lesser extent, Dr. Forbes. Men with serious professional or legal exposure, men who could not afford the alternative to payment and knew it. The smaller, more sporadic entries, Angus MacLean's among them, belonged to people whose secrets were damaging but survivable. People for whom Liddell had set a lower price because he had accurately assessed the ceiling of what they would tolerate. Jessie Curry fell between these categories, her payments regular enough to suggest routine, large enough to cause her genuine hardship, but not so large as to push her toward desperation. Liddell had been calibrating, Hamish realised. He had been managing his portfolio with the considered attention of a man who understands that a goose kept comfortable produces reliably, and that the killing thereof, while occasionally tempting, represents a one-time gain against a permanent loss. The 3 remaining initials he had not yet fully resolved were more troublesome. One he suspected, from the pattern of payments and their dates, belonged to a man named Donald Sutherland, who ran the small hardware shop on the far end of the main street, and with whom Hamish did indeed play drafts on alternate Fridays. Donald was a cheerful, voluble man who talked at considerable length about everything except, Hamish now reflected, anything that predated his arrival in Lochdu 7 years ago. The notebook phrase "shipment night" suggested something from that earlier period, possibly connected to the fishing industry around Ullapool, where Hamish believed Donald had worked before setting up the shop. He was not looking forward to that conversation. The second unresolved set of initials he associated tentatively with a woman named Patricia Gillies, who taught at the primary school in the next village and occasionally attended the Lochdu church. The phrase beside her initials was "daughter's truth," which was suggestive of something generational and therefore potentially very old, and her payments were among the smallest and most recent in the notebook. Liddell had apparently only recently acquired this particular piece of information, and had not yet fully deployed it. The third he could not place at all. The initials were RM, and the phrase was simply "the signature," which told him very little. The payments were substantial, not at the level of Callum Fraser's, but significant, and had been running for 2 years. He would come back to RM. He turned his attention, on the Tuesday, to the question of escalation. This was the element that mattered most for his purposes. Secrets, in Hamish's experience, did not by themselves produce murderers. What produced murderers was change. specifically the change from a bearable arrangement to an unbearable one, the moment when the calculation shifted and the cost of endurance overtook the cost of action. He was looking for whoever had reached that tipping point in the week before Liddell's death. He spread the payment records out chronologically and studied them for the elevation in amounts or frequency that would indicate Liddell had begun to press harder. What he found was a picture more complex than he had expected. 3 separate payments had been made in the month of September, the month of Liddell's death, as opposed to the usual pattern of 1 or 2 across an equivalent period. One of these he attributed to Jessie, whose note had demanded an increased sum by a date that now would never come. The second matched the initials he associated with Dr. Forbes, and its timing, just 10 days before Liddell died, coincided with the end of the football season, which told Hamish nothing useful, but which he wrote down anyway on the principle that detail refused early was detail unavailable later. The 3rd September payment came from the largest single entry in the notebook. It came from Callum Fraser. And the amount was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. Hamish sat with that figure for a long time. It was nearly 4 times any previous payment attributed to Fraser, and it followed the 2 large payments of the preceding year without any apparent triggering event that Hamish could identify. Liddell had simply, it appeared, raised the stakes. Whether he had done so because he was growing greedy, or because something had changed in the nature of what he knew, or because he had sensed some shift in Fraser's circumstances that opened a new angle of approach, Hamish could not yet determine. What he could determine was that a man who had paid that sum in September, and who carried whatever Fire Night and Child Witness referred to, had at least as compelling a reason as anyone in the notebook to want Fergus Liddell permanently removed from the business of knowing things. He made a note beside Fraser's initials. Most recent, largest payment, highest cumulative total, Fraser suggests serious historical event, and then he underlined it, which was not something he did often. On the Wednesday evening, he went to the hotel for a dram, partly because he wanted one, and partly because he had learned over the years that the bar at the Lochdoub Hotel was an information-gathering environment of a quality that no formal interview process could easily replicate. He had a talent for sitting in a public room and allowing its contents to come to him, which he exercised now without appearing to exercise it. He heard 3 things of interest. The first was that Callum Fraser had been seen in the village the previous Friday, a notable occurrence given what Mrs. Mackenzie had said about his habitual avoidance of Lochdoub, and notable also because it was after Liddell's death. Whatever had brought him in was no longer Liddell. The second was that Dr. Forbes had applied, apparently, for a temporary locum to cover his practice for the following month. This might mean nothing. It might mean that Forbes was considering whether Lochdoub remained a comfortable place to be. The third, offered with elaborate casualness by Archie McLean at the far end of the bar, was that Donald Sutherland had closed the hardware shop for 2 days the previous week without advance notice, which had inconvenienced several people who needed particular sizes of screw, and had generated a volume of speculation in the village entirely disproportionate to the objective significance of a 2-day shop closure. Hamish considered all 3 pieces of information over his dram, and then he considered his chart, and then he thought about the particular phrase Fire Night, and what, in a Highland village with a long memory, that might refer to. Then he ordered a second dram, because some thoughts required a degree of fortification before they could be properly entertained. He had, he reflected, a great many suspects and a great many motives, and the difficulty was not that the evidence pointed nowhere. The difficulty was that it pointed with equal and entirely unhelpful generosity in several directions simultaneously. Somewhere in the notebook was a person who had stopped calculating and started acting. He simply had not yet worked out which one. Chapter 7. The Obvious Suspect. Strathgarve Lodge sat 3 miles outside Lochdoub at the end of a private track that had never been formally maintained, and gave every impression of preferring it that way. The track was flanked on both sides by mature Scots pines that closed overhead in a manner that was less picturesque than oppressive, and it had a surface that suggested it had last been attended to during an administration that predated the current one by some considerable margin. Hamish's Land Rover managed it with the sturdy indifference of a vehicle that had seen considerably worse, which, operating out of Lochdoub, it had. He had telephoned ahead, which was a courtesy extended more for strategic than social reasons. A man like Callum Fraser, encountered without warning on his own ground, would have closed like a door in a draught. Forewarned, he might at least perform accessibility, and performance was, in Hamish's experience, its own kind of information. The lodge was substantial without being grand, a long low building of dark stone with small windows that seemed to peer outward suspiciously, set in grounds that had once been formal and were now reverting to a more honest wildness. There was a Land Rover older and considerably more battered than Hamish's own parked outside, and a pair of deerhounds that appeared at the corner of the building as Hamish pulled up, regarded lugs with complex and indeterminate interest, and were summoned back by a sharp whistle from the doorway before diplomacy could be tested. Callum Fraser was a tall man, heavily built, somewhere in his mid-60s, with a broad face under grey hair cut close and practical. He wore the clothes of a man who spent most of his time outdoors and had formed views about the uselessness of anything that required particular care. His eyes were dark and watchful in the way of someone who had spent a long time monitoring things, weather, land, other people, and had learned to do so without appearing to. He shook Hamish's hand in the doorway with a grip that communicated, efficiently and without excess, that he was not a man who required reassurance. They sat in what Fraser called the study, which was a room full of estate maps and fieldwork catalogues, and a desk buried under correspondence that had been attended to in the practical sense of being opened but not yet answered. A fire was burning, the real kind, laid with wood rather than the theatrical peat that some of the larger estates maintained for visiting journalists and television programmes about rural Scotland. Fraser poured 2 glasses of whisky without asking whether Hamish wanted one, which Hamish took as a reasonable indication of how the meeting had been categorised. "You'll be here about Liddell," Fraser said. "I will," Hamish agreed. He did not immediately reach for the notebook's evidence, or for the specific phrases that he knew would reach Fraser as efficiently as a hand around the throat. He asked instead about the general nature of the relationship, how long Fraser had known Liddell, in what capacity, how often they had been in contact. The questions were paced like a piece of music being played slower than its notation demanded, and Fraser answered them with the careful brevity of a man who has engaged a solicitor in his mind, if not yet in practice. What emerged from this controlled exchange was the broad shape of a relationship that had, on Fraser's part, been entirely involuntary from its inception. The fire in question had occurred 18 years ago in October on a farm property 3 miles north of Strathgarve. The farm had belonged at the time to a neighbouring family, the Kerrs, who had subsequently sold up and left the area. A hay barn had burned. The fire investigation had returned an open verdict. Possible accident, possible electrical fault, no definitive cause established. Nobody had been injured. This was the official version, which had stood for 18 years without challenge. The complication, the word Fraser used, with the flat precision of a man who has long since exhausted more colourful descriptions, was a 12-year-old boy who had been on the hillside above the farm that night, for reasons he had not disclosed to his parents or to the subsequent inquiry. This boy, now an adult living in Inverness, had seen something that the official version did not contain. Liddell had found him. How, Fraser did not know, and had apparently given up trying to determine. Hamish kept his expression carefully neutral throughout this account, which required some effort, because what Fraser was describing, obliquely, without once completing the central sentence, was arson. Not casual or accidental, but deliberate and purposeful, and connected in ways that Fraser was not going to specify, to a dispute over grazing rights that had been running between the Fraser estate and the Kerr family for the better part of a decade before the fire. The Kerr family had sold up within the year. The grazing dispute had ended with it. Hamish looked at the fire in the grate for a moment and then looked back at Fraser. The September payment, he said. It was considerably larger than the previous ones. Fraser's expression did not change in any gross sense, but something in the set of his jaw altered slightly, the way stone looks different when the light shifts on it. "He told me the boy had written something down," Fraser said. "A statement. He said he had a copy of it and intended to take it to the Procurator Fiscal, unless the arrangement was updated accordingly." "And you believed him?" "I had no means of knowing whether he was lying," pause, "and I could not afford to proceed as though he was." The figure in the notebook decoded to just over £3,400. For a man managing a Highland estate of Fraser's size, it was large but not ruinous, which meant that Liddell had been accurate in his assessment of the limit, pressing hard enough to cause genuine pain without quite pushing his subject to the point of no return. Or so he had perhaps calculated. The thought settled in the room between them with the comfortable weight of something that did not need to be stated aloud. Hamish let it sit. He asked Fraser at length about the week of the 23rd of September. Fraser answered with a thoroughness that went somewhat beyond what the question required. The names of his dinner guests on the Wednesday, the times they had arrived and departed, the fact that his estate manager and his estate manager's wife had both been present and had stayed until well past midnight. 3 more names followed, people of sufficient local standing that their word on the matter would be, as Fraser clearly understood, unimpeachable. It was, Hamish reflected, an alibi delivered with the fluency of a man who had rehearsed it without quite being certain he would need to. Not fabricated. The names were too specific, too easily verified, and Fraser was too intelligent a man to construct something that would not withstand scrutiny, but offered with a readiness that suggested he had known, from the morning of Liddell's death, that the question would eventually arrive. On the drive back down the impossible track, Hamish passed the place where the Scots pines thinned briefly, and a view opened across the moor toward the north. The hills were fully bare now, the last of the bracken gone to rust, the sky a uniform grey that promised rain before evening. It was beautiful in the stripped, indifferent way of Highland autumn, which did not arrange itself for admiration, but simply was. He was thinking about fire, about what a man might do to protect land his family had held for generations, about the difference between a secret that cost money and a secret that cost everything, about the fact that Callum Fraser had, by his own admission and by every figure in the notebook, the most to lose of anyone Liddell had been systematically destroying. By the time he reached the main road, the rain had begun in the tentative way of Highland rain that is assessing its commitment before proceeding. Luggs shifted on the passenger seat and pressed his nose against the window, breathing a cone of condensation onto the glass. Every line of evidence Hamish possessed ran through Callum Fraser like a road through a mountain. The money, the motive, the escalating pressure, the nature of the secret, all of it converged on the man at Strathgarth Lodge with the accumulated force of a case that was building toward a conclusion. He would need, he knew, to check those dinner party names. He already suspected, with the quiet instinct that had served him across 20 years of policing the same small stretch of Highland, that every one of them would confirm exactly what Fraser had said, which was, in its way, the most troubling thing of all. Chapter 8. The Alibi That Holds. The dinner party guests were, as Hamish had anticipated, entirely consistent in their accounts. He spent the better part of Thursday confirming this, driving between the homes and workplaces of the 5 people Callum Fraser had named with the methodical weariness of a man collecting evidence that is doing him no particular good. Each conversation was polite, cooperative, and unhelpful in exactly the same way. Fraser had hosted the dinner. The guests had arrived at 7 in the evening. There had been venison, which everyone mentioned with the involuntary enthusiasm of people who eat well infrequently. There had been a good deal of wine. The estate manager and his wife had been the last to leave, and the estate manager, a precise man named Ewan Gillies, who spoke as though every word had been individually costed, confirmed that he had looked at his watch when he got into his car and that it had been 23 minutes past midnight. The pathologist's estimated time of Liddell's death was between 7 and 11 in the evening of the 23rd of September. Callum Fraser had been in his dining room at Strathgarth Lodge, eating venison and drinking claret for the entire duration of that window. He had been there in the company of 5 witnesses, none of whom had any particular reason to lie for him, and all of whom gave their accounts with the unconsidered confidence of people reporting something they had not, until approached by a constable, thought worthy of particular memory. Hamish drove back to Lochdoub in the early afternoon with the rain coming in low off the loch, and Luggs occupying the passenger seat with his chin on the door rest and his eyes half closed, performing an approximation of philosophical detachment. He made fresh tea at the station, and stood before his chart for a long time. The difficulty with an investigation that has been building steadily toward a single conclusion is that the removal of that conclusion does not simply leave a vacuum. It leaves instead the considerably more complicated situation of all the previous reasoning still present, but now pointing in no particular direction, like a set of signposts after the destination they indicated has been quietly removed from the map. Fraser had not killed Liddell. The alibi was not the kind that could be argued around or attributed to collective misremembering. It was solid, independently confirmed, and utterly impervious to the pressure of circumstance, however compelling that circumstance might be. Which meant, Hamish reasoned, working through it with the methodical patience that characterized his best thinking, that either the killer was someone he had already spoken to or someone he had not yet properly considered. The notebook contained 9 sets of initials, and he had accounted for the movements of precisely 2 people during the relevant hours with any thoroughness. Angus MacLean, who had been at sea on the evening of the 23rd, a fact his crew could confirm, and which Hamish had quietly verified, and Fraser, whose alibi was now beyond question. The remaining 7 were less examined. He looked at the chart afresh, trying to see it without the assumptions that had accumulated around it over the previous 2 weeks. He had been drawn, as anyone would have been, toward the larger numbers, the graver secrets, the names that carried the most visible weight of desperation. This was rational, but it was also, he now recognised, exactly the kind of rational thinking that a patient and careful person might rely on to direct attention away from themselves. He thought about the phrase, before their name ever made it into the ledger. It came to him gradually, the way thoughts that have been working below the surface of attention will sometimes deliver themselves with the timing of something that has been queued and waiting. He had been treating the notebook as a complete record, as the totality of Liddell's operations, containing every victim and every arrangement in full. But Liddell had been a man who worked incrementally. He had begun with Angus MacLean 8 months after acquiring the relevant knowledge. He had approached Jessie Curry by her account nearly a year after he had obtained the information about her. The pattern was consistent: observation, acquisition, patience, and then approach, which meant that the notebook, as he currently held it, might represent not the whole of Liddell's activity, but only its established phase. The earlier phase, the watching, the gathering, the period before deployment, would leave no trace in the ledger. It would exist only as intention. There might, in other words, be a victim who was not yet a victim in the formal sense. Someone Liddell had identified and had begun to approach, or had been about to approach, whose name had not yet been entered because the payments had not yet begun. Someone whose secret Liddell had found and had not yet converted into income. Someone, consequently, for whom there would be no entry to find, no coded phrase to decode, and no financial pattern to trace. Someone who had reason to act not because they had been paying for years and could pay no longer, but because they had seen what was coming and had moved to prevent it before it arrived. Hamish sat down. He thought about who Liddell had been spending time with in the months before his death. Mrs. Mackenzie had given him the habitual visitors, Angus, Forbes, Fraser, Jessie Curry. But these were the established arrangements, the regular appearances of people maintaining the machinery of their own suppression. He needed to think about recent changes, new patterns, who Liddell had been seeing in the weeks or days immediately before he died, outside his usual circuit. He went through what he knew, the envelope on the sideboard, addressed in an unknown hand, which the Strathbane forensics team had taken away and not yet reported on. The neighbours on either side of the cottage, neither of whom he had spoken to beyond the most initial preliminary exchanges in the first day. The question of whether Shona at the hotel had noticed anything unusual in Liddell's manner or company in the fortnight before his death. And then there was the matter of the chocolates. The Belgian chocolates in Liddell's kitchen press, 3/4 consumed, open, and recently visited. Liddell had not, by any account Hamish had gathered, been a man who brought luxury food items into his own home for his own consumption. The expensive whisky had been there, but whisky was different. Whisky was a man's private indulgence, the reasonable reward of a life conducted largely in the grey. Chocolates were different. Chocolates were social. They were the kind of thing that appeared when someone was expected. He put on his coat and drove to the hotel. Shona was restocking the shelves behind the bar when he arrived and received him with the calm equanimity she brought to all disruptions of her working day, which in Lochdoub were regular and various. She thought about his question carefully, which Hamish appreciated. She did not produce an answer immediately and then embroider it, which was the approach favoured by people who confuse the helpfulness of speed with the helpfulness of accuracy. Yes, she said eventually, there had been something. In the 2 weeks before Liddell died, he'd been at the bar on 3 occasions when Morag Sinclair was also there, and on 2 of those 3 occasions they had sat together and spoken for some time. This was not in itself remarkable. They were neighbouring shopkeepers, and proximity generates conversation whether you want it to or not. But on one of those evenings she had noticed Liddell speaking with a particular quality of attention, the focused, still quality that she associated with him at his most deliberate, and Morag had listened with a fixed, very careful smile. Did she look distressed? Hamish asked. Shona considered this. She looked, she said slowly, like someone who had just been told something they already suspected but had hoped they were wrong about. Hamish thanked her and drove back to the station. He stood before his chart again. He took his pencil and he wrote, at the bottom of the column, a new set of initials. Beside them he wrote no phrase because he did not yet have one. He wrote no figure because no payment had been made. He drew a slow, deliberate line beneath the initials and looked at them for a long time. The investigation had, without his quite noticing the moment it happened, turned itself completely around. Chapter 9. The Unwritten Victim. The crafts shop was called, with the plain confidence of a woman who had no patience for whimsy, Morag's. It occupied a narrow premises between Liddell's now shuttered antiques business and a small electrical repair shop that had been closing down for approximately 4 years and had yet to complete the process. The window of Morag's contained a rotating display of locally made textiles, carved wooden objects of practical purpose, and the occasional piece of jewellery worked in silver with the kind of restrained elegance that appealed to visitors who wanted something genuinely Highland rather than something with a stag on it. It was a good shop, honestly run. Hamish had bought a scarf there 2 Christmases ago for a cousin in Inverness, and had been told it was very fine, which was a higher form of praise in that quarter than it might sound. He had spent the 2 days since his conversation with Shona conducting the kind of background investigation that produced no dramatic findings and a great deal of quiet, incremental revelation. He had written to the General Register Office in Edinburgh on a matter that he framed carefully and sent by recorded post. He had made 2 telephone calls, one to a colleague in Dornoch and one to a retired sergeant in Ullapool who had a memory for names and a willingness to use it. He had driven, on the second morning, to the records office in Strathbane, where a woman named Margaret had located what he needed with the focused efficiency of a person who loves her filing system and is pleased when someone arrives who appreciates it. What he had assembled, spread across his kitchen table on the 3rd evening, was the careful, partial outline of a life that did not entirely match the one presented to Lochdoub. Morag Sinclair had arrived in the village 9 years ago, following, she had told people who asked, a difficult period in Aberdeen after the death of her husband. She had spoken of this history sparingly but consistently. A marriage, a loss, a decision to start again somewhere quieter. People in Lochdoub had accepted this because it was the kind of history that did not demand elaboration, and because Morag herself was the kind of person who invited trust rather than interrogation. She was competent, she was warm without being effusive, and she made exceptional shortbread. In Lochdoub, these qualities constituted a character reference of the highest order. The difficulty that Hamish had uncovered was not that the history was entirely false, it was that certain elements of it belonged to a different woman. The Morag Sinclair of the official record, the birth certificate, the marriage certificate, the national insurance history, matched the broad outline of the story told in Lochdoub. But the woman who had died in a road accident outside Aberdeen in the spring of 14 years ago, whose death certificate Hamish had obtained from Margaret in Strathbane, with something between professional detachment and genuine regret, was the original bearer of that name. She had been 31 years old. She had been a teacher. She had died on a Tuesday evening on a road outside the city in circumstances recorded as accidental. The woman currently living and working in Lochdoub under that name had taken it with a thoroughness and intelligence that suggested considerable prior thought. The national insurance number was real. It had belonged to the original Morag Sinclair, who had no living family in Scotland that Hamish could trace. The driving licence, the bank account, the tenancy agreement on the shop, all of it was anchored to documentation that would withstand casual scrutiny and had, for 9 years, withstood scrutiny of every kind. He sat with this for a long time. He thought about the man she had described as a difficult period and a loss. He thought about what drove a person to the considerable and irreversible step of assuming another identity entirely, with all the sustained vigilance that required, the daily management of a constructed self, the permanent low-level alertness to the possibility of discovery. This was not the work of a casual deceiver. It was the work of someone who had needed, with great urgency, to not be found. He thought about the phrase that Shona had used, like someone who had just been told something they already suspected but had hoped they were wrong about. He went to the crafts shop on a Friday morning, when the village was quiet and the sky had the flat, pale quality of a day that has not yet decided what it wants to be. He turned the sign in the door to closed from inside and drew the bolt, which was not something he had done in a shop since an incident involving a stolen bicycle and a hardware supplier in Nothern 11 years ago, and which had the practical advantage of ensuring that they would not be interrupted by anyone wanting a carved wooden butter dish. Morag was behind the counter, sorting a delivery of stock with the methodical attention she brought to all tasks. She looked up when he closed the door. She looked at the sign. She looked at him. She put the stock down. "Sit down, Morag," he said, and there was nothing official in how he said it. He pulled a stool from beside the display stand and sat down himself, and she came around from behind the counter and took the chair she kept near the window for customers who needed to try on rings, and they sat across from each other in the quiet shop with the grey morning light coming in between the things in the window. He told her what he had found. He did it plainly, and without theatrical build-up, because she was not a woman who would be served by anything other than directness, and because he owed her that much. He told her about the original Morag Sinclair and the death certificate, and the national insurance number, and the records in Strathbane. He told her that Liddell had been visiting the hotel bar on evenings when she was there. He told her what Shona had observed. He did not tell her about the chocolates, though he thought about it. She listened without interrupting. Her hands, folded in her lap, were entirely still. Not the stillness of shock, but the stillness of someone who has been waiting for a particular door to open, and is now watching it open, and is finding the reality of it both worse and less terrible than the anticipation. When he finished, she looked at him with those steady green eyes for a long moment. "His name was David Rennie," she said. "Not Liddell's name. The other one." She spoke carefully, choosing each part of the account with the deliberation of a woman who has had years in which to decide how she would tell this if it ever became necessary. Her husband, the man she had left behind when she had become someone else, had been violent in the sustained and systematic way of people who are charming outside their front doors and entirely different within them. The details she gave were sparse. She was not asking for sympathy and did not perform distress, but sufficient. She had left him twice. On the second return he had told her, with the quiet certainty of a man who means what he says, that if she left again he would find her wherever she went, and that would be the end of it. She had believed him. She had reason to. The original Morag Sinclair had been a colleague, a friend, the only person who had known the plan. When she died in the accident, there was no one left who knew. The identity had become simply the life she lived, and the life had become real, as lives do when you inhabit them long enough, and Lochdoub had become home in a way that no place she had previously lived had ever quite managed. Liddell, she said, had approached her 3 weeks before his death. He had not been specific. He had been, she thought, still in the process of gathering, testing the shape of what he had, probing its edges. He had said enough to make clear that he knew something was wrong about her history, and he had said it with the particular smile of a man who is enjoying the approach as much as the arrival. He had suggested they might talk further. "And did you meet with him?" Hamish asked. She held his gaze without flinching. "He came to the shop," she said, "the week before he died." Hamish looked at her. Outside, a car passed on the main street and continued on toward the hotel. The sign in the door said, "Closed." Luggs, who had settled beneath the ring-trying chair with his chin on her foot, breathed quietly in the particular rhythm that indicated he was either asleep or had decided the situation did not require his active participation. "Tell me about that visit," Hamish said. Chapter 10. Quiet Justice. The visit, she said, had been on a Tuesday. Liddell had come to the shop at 4:30, which was 20 minutes before she normally closed, and he had done so with the manner of a man paying a social call. Unhurried, pleasant, carrying with him the faint smell of expensive whiskey that she had come to associate with his more deliberate appearances. He had looked at several items on the shelves with an expression of polite interest that had nothing to do with the items. He had waited until the last customer left. Then he had told her, with the composed efficiency of someone reading from a prepared document, precisely what he knew. He knew that the name she used was not her own. He knew that the original Morag Sinclair had died 14 years ago outside Aberdeen. He knew enough about the circumstances she had left behind to suggest he had made contact with people from that earlier life, though he named no one specifically, which was consistent, Hamish thought, with the technique he had apparently applied to all his subjects, implying rather than disclosing keeping the full extent of his knowledge deliberately unclear so that the person across from him could never be certain how much remained concealed. He had not named a figure. Not yet. He had said, with the particular smile she had described, that there was no urgency, that these things could be discussed at leisure, and that she should come to his cottage for supper the following Sunday, so that they could talk the matter through properly and arrive at something that suited them both. The word supper was the detail that had stayed with her most clearly. The domesticity of it, the extraordinary composure of a man arranging a dinner engagement around the destruction of the only life she had managed to build for herself. She had said yes. She had said it quietly and without visible reaction, and she had held that composure until he left the shop, and then she had sat down on the floor behind the counter for some time, which was the only moment in the entire account where her voice altered in a way that suggested she was describing something that had genuinely undone her, however briefly. She had spent the remainder of the week thinking. This, Hamish reflected, was the part that separated her account from what he had heard from the others. Angus MacLean had not thought. He had simply absorbed the blow and gone on paying. Jessie Curry had thought, and then capitulated. Forbes had sat in his car for 20 minutes and then gone inside and written a cheque. Each of them had reached the same conclusion, that the cost of paying was lower than the cost of resistance, and that resistance, in any case, was not clearly available to them. Morag had spent a week thinking and had arrived at a different conclusion. She had not arrived there easily, she said, and she said it without any quality of self-justification. She said it as a statement of fact, in the same register in which she had given all the other facts, and Hamish believed it. She had considered what it would mean to pay, not merely the money, which she could probably manage in the short term, but the indefinite continuation of the arrangement, the years ahead of it, the slow diminishment of living permanently in a man's pocket. She had considered the alternative of disclosure, going to the authorities herself, laying out the full history, accepting whatever consequence followed. She had considered, most practically of all, what David Rennie would do when Liddell's information led inevitably back to the person she had been, and where she could be found. David Rennie, she told Hamish evenly, was alive. She knew this because she had checked, carefully and from a distance, 3 years ago. He was alive, and he was in Inverness, and he was still the man she'd run from, in the assessment of people who knew him. She had not checked again, because checking required more exposure than she was prepared to risk. But she had no reason to believe the fundamental situation had changed. What Liddell was offering, dressed in the language of mutual arrangement and civilised supper, was the eventual unravelling of all of this. She had gone to his cottage on the Sunday. She had brought the Belgian chocolates, which she had bought in Strathbane on the Friday, because arriving with nothing would have seemed odd, and because the appearance of social normality was the only thing she had left to maintain. Liddell had poured the whisky she had also expected. He had been pleasant throughout the meal, which she had sat through with the focused endurance of a woman performing a role while the actual business of her mind was conducted elsewhere. It was after supper, when Liddell had leaned back in his chair and produced the specific figure he had in mind, large enough to cause her serious harm, framed with the polite inexorability of a man who has done this before and knows precisely how the architecture of such a conversation is built, that something had resolved in her. She did not dress it in retrospective anger. She did not tell it as a story of rage overcoming reason. She said, simply and without embellishment, that she had stood up from the table and that she had pushed him. The chair had been near the fireplace. He had gone backward into it, catching the edge of it on his way down, and the impact of the fall had been, by the account of the post-mortem that Hamish was now reordering in his mind, the likely proximate cause of a cardiac event in a man whose heart Dr. Kerr's tissue samples had suggested had not been in sound condition. It was not a certainty. It would never be a certainty. And he understood that this was not incidental to how she had told the story, and not incidental to the choice he was now being required to make. She had not called for help. She had stood and looked at him for some time, and then she had washed the plates and the glasses, and she had taken the chocolates back with her because she had been for a moment not quite capable of thinking, and then she'd walked home through the cool September dark and had sat in her kitchen with the lights off until morning. "The whisky glass on the mantelpiece," Hamish said. "I rinsed it," she said, "and then I thought that was too careful, and I put it back." He looked at her for a long time. Outside, the pale morning had made up its mind at last and was becoming something better, a thin brightness moving across the loch from the east, the kind of light that did not make promises but was, for the moment, genuinely present. A car moved along the main street. Somewhere above the village a curlew called once and did not call again. Hamish thought about 9 people in this village who had, for varying periods, lived smaller, quieter, more frightened lives because of the man now lying in the Strathbane mortuary. He thought about Angus MacLean on his boat, carrying a fraud that had cost him far more in payments than it had ever yielded in benefit. He thought about Jessie Curry's tightly squared cushions, the bureau that held a letter she had been unable to throw away. He thought about Dr. Forbes walking in a car park at the end of his afternoon list, carrying a mistake that a better friend had led him into, and that a worse man had been bleeding him for ever since. And he thought about a woman who had spent 9 years being a good neighbour and an honest trader, and a genuine and useful presence in a community she had chosen because it was far from the thing she was afraid of, and who had spent those same 9 years maintaining with perfect daily discipline the one fiction that made all of it possible. He thought about justice, which was a thing he had always found more complicated in practice than any training had suggested it would be. Luggs raised his head from her foot, looked at Hamish with the particular brown-eyed gravity that seemed, at certain moments, to contain more judgment than any creature of his modest academic credentials had a right to, and then set his head down again. Hamish reached into his jacket pocket and removed the small, dark green notebook. He turned it over once in his hands. Then he set it on the display counter beside a row of silver bracelets, worked in a pattern of interlocking Celtic knotwork, each one made locally, each one genuine, and he stood up and straightened his cap, which had required straightening, and he called Luggs to heel. "I'll be investigating this case for some time yet," he said. "These things take considerable effort, and the paperwork alone is a trial." He looked at her steadily. "It may be that no conclusion is ever reached." She looked back at him with those green eyes, and she said nothing, and he understood that she understood. He walked to the door, drew back the bolt, and turned the sign from closed to open, because a shop that stays closed without reason is the kind of thing that gets noticed in Lochdoub, and the last thing any of them needed at this particular moment was Mrs. Mackenzie beginning to wonder. He walked out into the brightening morning with Luggs at his heel, and the loch shining at the end of the main street, and he did not look back. He had a report to write that would say very little, and several people to leave in peace, and a village to go on looking after in the unhurried, unambitious way that was, in the end, the thing he did best. He had chosen silence before. He would not pretend it was a simple choice, or an entirely comfortable one, or one that some higher tribunal than the Lochdoub morning would necessarily endorse. But Fergus Liddell's ledger was closed, and the people whose names had been written in it, in their various measures of guilt and fear and endurance, were free of it. That, he decided, walking past the post office and the hotel and the quiet, familiar length of the waterfront he'd spent 20 years choosing not to leave, would have to do. It was, on the whole, a very fine morning,